Hello everyone, this is Super Papega. Uh, this is my 3.23 Affliction frequently asked question about cArn's bone shatter build. So I'm making this because I think a lot of people often ask like questions about certain things. So this is like a compilation of the stuff I think might be relevant to what people usually ask. So the most common one is bone shatter versus jug, right? So people ask about which is more tanky, or which is better, right? So Slayer is actually more tanky, especially against bosses, right? This means that endgame Slayer is objectively better than jug, since 3.23 endgame is still revolved around Pinnacle and Atlas bosses. More so, even Pox has said that Bone Shatter Slayer is definitely more tanky than Bone Shatter Jug. There are scenarios that, Jug is more tanky than Slayer. So where does Slayer gets its tankiness from? The main thing Slayer gets its tankiness from is from the leech, right? So leech is actually really huge. Like you can even have 10k healing per second, even like crazy amount of leech, right? And then you have tainted pack or the golden rule. So this is more for the end game, either early end game or late end game, where you can use the poison dot to heal yourself even more, right? So this is huge tankiness stuff. So this kind of stuff is very useful when when you want to face tank stuff like Maven or like any of the Pinnacle boss. You can just face tank them, and then you can have your 100% melee uptime, right? Because melee uptime is very important to deal damage, right? And get your 45 charges and whatnot charges. So where does Jug get its tankiness from? Right, it gets its tankiness from block armor resistance and a quote-unquote convert from its ascension. And scenarios where Jugs can be more tanky than Slayer is, when you have small mobs in the mapping, right? So this is how the armor works, right? So if you get big damage, they don't get mitigated from the armor, right? So what that means is that you want to rely on regeneration, right, or recovery. And then for Jug, Bone Shatter, you usually get your recovery from health regeneration, which is much slower than your Slayer, Leech, or Poison regeneration. And then small damage from mobs gets mitigated much more. So if you want to play Jug Bone Shatter, it's mostly for mapping, and you can't do bosses, right? You basically can't do bosses very well, right? In if you have like 10 divines on a Bone Shatter Jug versus a 10 divine on a Slayer Bone Shatter, right? Slayer Bone Shatter would definitely be more tanky than the Jug when fighting bosses. Right, then for 3.23, people ask, why should we use shock tincture instead of poison tincture? Right? Poison tincture gives ability to poison, but it does not give the poison chance, right? So when using tainted pack golden rule, you want to have poison chance, right? So you might be thinking, oh, maybe I can just use poison tincture, right? So but poison tincture doesn't give poison chance, right? So bone shatter is a physical strike ability. This means that it can really cause poison, right? So poison tincture is useless. When should I use Primalis, right? If you don't care about min max, if you want something more comfortable, like because you have charms in Primalis where it gives you resistances, and there are also charms that give spell suppression, right? So it's very comfortable to build around. You don't have to don't have to invest as much into your gearing. You can get the cat resist, and you can get high spell suppression earlier without spending as much resources, right? And then there's also like when and why, when, and how we should use the writing jar, which is the the small worms, right? So usage of it, so why usage grants fortify and other charges, and as well as a leech, right? Because you get your over leech, right, from your ascension in Slayer. And then you can use it for mapping and bossing. So in mapping, you can pop in any of the scenarios. Rare monsters cannot be leech, right? So when the rare monsters cannot be leech, you would lose some stuff like you might still maintain a bit of overleach from the other mobs around, but if like the rare monster is only one around, then you need to pop it so that because some of your skill tree nodes relies on leeching, so you need to pop the writing jar to give yourself leech to deal more damage, right? Because of that, right? Then rare monster cannot be stunned, right? So if the worms get popped out, right, it might be around the enemy, right? And then if you have the non-vowel strikes can hit an additional enemy, it will hit the worms. And then you have the trauma AoE, right? And then it will AoE the area, and then it kills the rare mob faster, because you don't want to fight a rare monster that cannot be stunned, right? So just kill it faster. And then in bossing, you can pop before the boss start, use your warlord's mark on the leeches, right? And then you mark it already, and then you hit it, and then you mark it, and then you hit it, right? So boss downtime or the invulnerable phase, right? If you want to maintain your, let's say, your adrenaline or onslaught or whatsoever, you can use this, right? To give yourself, uptime on your leech status. So another question is, why is the cArn's loot filter not working? There are sounds in it. You either download it from cArn's Discord or remove it via configuration on the filter plate. I am dying from bleed when using golden rule. So make sure your weapon and gems do not have bleed chance, right? So this is a common mistake people make, right? Like they think that vulnerability is the same as bleed chance hit, right? So if you have the hit bleed chance, because of how golden rule works, it will bleed yourself, right? Then you instantly die because your bleed is gonna be very strong. And then if you are using vulnerability ability, right, make sure you're running a map that does not have the vulnerability modifier, right? So this actually is believed to be a bug with PoE, right? And then if you want to run maps with Val, make sure you take Endless Hunger instead of Hitman, right? And then because if you take Endless Hunger instead of Hitman, you also need to make sure your X have Culling Strike instead, right? Or you can either make sure X have Culling Strike, or take a charm that gives you Culling Strike, because the charms was from, if you're running Primalis, also has Culling Strike. So normal Bone Shatter versus complex Bone Shatter versus divergent Bone Shatter. So divergent Bone Shatter is still the best, I believe, because divergent Bone Shatter gives attack speed per trauma, right? Means you ramp very quickly, you ramp up, right? You ramp, and then bam, and then you go to like 40 stacks of Bone Shatter trauma or something like that, right? So complex Bone Shatter has a max trauma of 9, and then if you go to 10, it resets back. This is also quite safe, especially for Slayer, because you'll probably never die from trauma damage, right? It is good for both bossing and mapping, because especially in mapping, your trauma stacks are not going to be very high, right? and then it is kind of a replacement for Divergent BONESHATTER. It's your endgame gem. And also, the good thing about it, right, is that even though on the tooltip it says tooltip wise it thinks that you're dealing more trauma damage to yourself, but if you think like if you are at 40 stacks of trauma, right, usually Slayer cannot maintain your 40 stacks of trauma, right? You might have issues maintaining such a high number of trauma if that ever happens, right? Usually the boss or whatnot already dies at like 10 trauma stacks, so you don't go that high unless facing a pinnacle boss, right? So but because it's only 9, right, 9 stacks, you can only get at most 9 stacks of trauma. You always take less trauma damage than a normal bone shatter at like 40 or 40 stacks of trauma. So Atlas 3, do I have to spec or do expedition? If you're in trade lead, you don't need to. Do I have to do or spec betrayal? If you're in trade lead, you don't need to. Do I have to spec or do essences? If you're in trade lead, you don't need to. So people usually ask like, why do I have to do expedition first and whatnot? If you're in SSF, expedition is your best way of getting your weapon, and then essences because you need it for crafting, right? And then betrayal, all SSF needs to do betrayal, unless you are not gonna do like endgame stuff, right? If you're not planning to do endgame, then you don't need to do betrayal, but you gotta probably do betrayal most of the time. Do I have to full clear the map? Yes, if the following applies, right? You have no idea what you're doing, or especially if you're solo self-found, right? There are exceptions to that. You're already in the end game already, right? You're like in the super end game. Super end game solo self-found. You probably don't have to full clear the map, right? So full clearing is very important because it gives you loot, right? If you don't full clear, it means you're wasting the map. Alright, so this the frequently asked question that cArn's BONESHATTER Slayer usually gets during this league. I hope it answers your questions. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.